will formally get us started for today's event. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our new series, Memory, Heritage, and History Through Jewish Eyes. We are honored to have you on this journey with us of exploration and discovery. Of course, we're going to be guided today by the esteemed educator and historian, Paul Forgasz. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I am Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. At CWB, we are dedicated to opening minds and hearts through transformative educational experiences. Through our work, we connect participants to history, memory, and culture in ways that inspire reflection and action. Over the past 4 years since COVID, CWB has hosted 672 virtual programs, engaging a global audience in meaningful dialogue. Additionally, in this academic year, we are hosting 128 in-person programs and have brought together over 62,000 participants in our in-person setting, fostering these deep connections and impactful learning experiences. Since our founding more than 14 years ago, we have reached over 87,000 people across 84 countries and nearly every United States. Looking ahead, 2025 is already shaping up to be an exciting year, with 21 captivating events on the calendar and many more in the works. In today's session, Seeing Places Through Jewish Eyes, we will step back into the golden age of Jewish life under Muslim rule in medieval Spain, a period marked by remarkable intellectual, cultural, and spiritual achievements. In this session, you'll be transported to a time when Jewish communities thrived within the dynamic society of Al-Andalus. Paul will explore the profound impact of the Spanish Jewish poets, philosophers, and scholars whose works resonate far beyond the era. We encourage you to engage, ask questions, and reflect as we embark on this fascinating journey together. If you'd like to support our mission, my colleague Jackie will drop a donation link in the chat for you in just a moment. And with that, it is now my great pleasure to welcome Paul Forgasz. Paul Forgasz is a Melbourne-based educator, historian, and Jewish heritage tour guide. He has spent decades deepening the understanding of Jewish history, identity, and culture. Formerly a principal of Mount Scopius's College of Secondary Campus, he has also lectured in Bible and Jewish history at Monash University. Since 2010, Paul has led immersive Jewish heritage tours across Europe for the Jewish Museum of Australia, specializing in medieval Spain, European Jewry, and the interplay of history, memory, and place. Actively engaged in Jewish-Christian dialogue, he brings history to life through travel and storytelling, enriching learners worldwide. And with that, Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jackie, and welcome back again, everyone. What I'm going to actually do is, before I begin with today's advertised session, I just want to take up from where I left off last week, very, very briefly, just finish off our discussion. So I will share my PowerPoint. There we go. And yep, let me just share that. Are we okay there, Jackie?
It's looking good. Yep, there you go.
Okay, all right. So last week I posed the question, really the central question I addressed was how a curated educational travel experience can incorporate elements of the story of Jewish peoplehood. I started off really with the question of what makes Jewish travel Jewish, and I reframed that by leading us into this question about how a curated experience can actually incorporate elements of the story of Jewish peoplehood. And these are the things that we covered. Through such an experience, one can connect with the Jewish past. It's an entree into the concept of Jewish collective memory. One is introduced to different elements of Jewish community across the world, different cultures, and we also talked about this concept of people as sight. I think people often tend to think of travel as places to see, and I think very, very importantly, it's just as important to think of it as people that you talk to, because that's where the story comes to life. Where I want to pick up this morning and really finish off what we spoke about last week, is this idea of Jewish and non-Jewish sites and looking at these sites through Jewish eyes. You may recall that when I posed the question last week, what makes Jewish travel Jewish? Very many people will often think immediately of synagogues and cemeteries. But rarely do people think of non-Jewish sites, especially, let's say, churches, when they travel, as having anything to do with a Jewish narrative. And this is what Jeremy relights. He says the boundaries that separate Jewish sites and non-Jewish sites need not be defined by formal and standardized definitions. So few would argue with the idea of synagogues and cemeteries as solidly and clearly Jewish sites. But what then of churches in general, or specific churches in particular, or indeed any site, any non-Jewish site that has implications for the Jews? So to give you a sort of an example, when you go to the city of Strasbourg in France, I have not yet led a tour group to France. It's something I may be doing, but I've certainly been there and I mapped out the contours of a possible future tour. But in Strasbourg in France, you come to the great cathedral of Strasbourg, and one of the things you'll encounter is these two statues. If you're not aware of their significance, you might just pass them by without being aware that there's a deeply Jewish story embedded here. Because what you've got on the left-hand side is what came to be known as in the Middle Ages as ecclesia, the body of the church, the body of Christianity. And on the other side is synagoga, the body of the Jewish people. And what's interesting to observe is the contrasting ways in which they are represented on the same church portal. These are not separate statues. So you look at ecclesia, the cup, the chalice, the cup of victory, the cross, which is also a staff and a sword, the crown on her head. This is the church victorious, whereas synagoga, the Jewish people, defeated. The broken spear, blindfolded to the truth of Christianity, holding the tablets of the law in a downward position rather in an upward position of victory. In other words, the whole point of this is to emphasize to those entering the church, and think in Middle Ages, people were not literate. They were educated through representational sort of artwork and sculpture. And the whole idea, of course, of these two statues is to emphasize the stark difference between church and synagogue, because there was a great deal of tension between Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages. And something like this allows you to open up and introduce people to the framework of that whole narrative of Jewish-Christian relations in the Middle Ages. Then you get a similar depiction in the cathedral in Worms. This is, again, you get a similar, not the same, but the similar depiction of the body of the synagoga. Again, notice the blindfold representing the idea of Judaism as blind to the truth of Christianity. I spoke last week about the great cathedral in Speyer. Again, a non-Jewish site, but when you stand in front of the cathedral, it's an opportunity to talk about the fact that this was the very place where the bishop in the 13th century issued a charter inviting Jews to the town of Speyer. In fact, the town of Speyer is one of 3 towns in Germany that represents the beginnings of the Jewish story in Germany. So again, another non-Jewish site. You go to Granada and you get this magnificent statue in one of the main squares of Granada. This is Christopher Columbus and Queen Isabella. Seeing it up close is much better. You can see Queen Isabella is handing Columbus the Charter of Exploration. Go out and explore the New World. What has this got to do with anything Jewish? Well, put aside the fact, the highly contested fact as to whether Columbus himself had Jewish roots. It's a very debated sort of question. But if you look where my cursor is, in the very background there, on the corner of that street, what you will actually see behind the statue is this figure, a much smaller and a much more modest statue. And this is the statue of Judah ibn Tibbon. Judah ibn Tibbon was a famous translator who brought to the Christian world, in fact, many classical works of Judaism, of Islam, even of the classical world. And he stands there behind this particular statue. Now, when I bring groups there, what I actually do is I hold up this picture juxtaposing the two images. And I ask them to reflect on the significance of these two statues and what they differently represent. People give all sorts of answers, but one of the things that I find particularly interesting is that this particular statue of Christopher Columbus and Isabella is sort of the idea that in the Middle Ages in particular, the power of the church was represented by territorial conquest. Very, very much part of it. In the Middle Ages, by contrast, Jews had no power. Jews were a subject people. In fact, they were exiled from their own land, from the land of Israel. And the one thing, however, that they did, and notice that the significance here is that both statues are represented by scrolls, but the one thing that Jews did have the power to do was to extend the power of the written word to the world itself. And we talk a little bit about this, about the differences in the concept of how one, in the midst of powerlessness, Jews were actually able to demonstrate power as well. And it gives us an opportunity to talk about these themes. So this very, very distinctly general non-Jewish site becomes a place of interacting and thinking about the significance of the Jewish story as well. And finally, where I want to finish off, and I'm going to give you more examples of this when we talk about Spain today, but I want to talk about this concept of invisible sites, what I refer to often as the presence of the absence. Think about that concept. Something which is where it's absent, there you see the presence. And so Jeremy Lee writes, for some, this is at its greatest in Holocaust sites. For others, the great challenge must surely be Spain, where the story is so much larger than the sites available to show it. 500 years of not being there inevitably takes its toll on the visibility of Jewish sites, leaving a handful of buildings and some street plaques saying Juderia, which is the Spanish name for an old Jewish quarter. Symbolically, Jewish travel involves much virtual archaeology, which in educational terms means creating a picture in the mind or convincing the audience that even though it may not feel that way, the land that they are standing on is really sacred. And so a wonderful example is when you travel through many parts of Europe today, in the top left-hand corner, you'll see what are called stolpersteine. So these are placed on the footpath outside houses where Jews were deported to various concentration camps. And so this is this very powerful concept of the presence of absence. These Jewish families are no longer there. Their homes are now inhabited by other people, but this is a reminder of the presence of that absence. You go to Spain, and in various places, you will see this symbol, either on a wall or generally on a footpath, and basically it reads Sepharad. Sepharad means basically is the Hebrew word for Spain, but embedded within those letters, there is another set of Hebrew letters, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it says Zachor, Zachor Sepharad, in memory of the Jews of Spain. Again, you're very much aware of the presence of absence here, because you've got to understand many of these places were in the Middle Ages thriving centers of Jewish life, which basically disappeared when Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. And you become very much aware of this concept of the presence of absence. You go to the Santa Maria la Blanca Cathedral, or it's a church, not a cathedral, in Seville. It's a Baroque church, magnificent Baroque church. You walk in, you would not feel in any way connected to a Jewish story. On one particular year, when I took a group through into the church, they happened to be doing renovations inside the church. And on this right-hand side wall of the church, as they were doing renovations, some plasterwork fell away, and what they discovered was actually the wall of an old medieval synagogue that had actually become a church. How starkly do you feel when you see that surrounded in this amazing Baroque church, this bare wall that exposes what was once a thriving synagogue in the city of Seville. Again, the presence of absence in front of your eyes. And certainly the statue that I showed earlier, you have to appreciate, I'm going to talk about this very shortly, that Granada was once the great center of what people came to refer to as the golden age of Spanish Jewry. And in the whole of Granada today, where Jewish life once throbbed and thrived and was very, very flourishing, this is the only remaining remnant of what was once a great Jewish community. And it's not even a medieval remnant, it's obviously a modern statue that was developed in the 20th century. You go to the city of Girona, again, one of the great centers of medieval Jewish life, and you see the presence of the absence, and there's not even a mezuzah there, but once a place where a mezuzah would have been placed in the wall. That's in Girona. In Barcelona, what's very interesting is you walk through the old quarter of Barcelona, and you'll come across this particular wall here, and you might be wondering what people are looking at. I think this is me with the group one year, and people often stop and they're sort of looking up and saying, what's all that about? And what you see fascinatingly is you see these walls, but let me take you in further. What you actually see are Hebrew writing. What they are fragments of tombstones that were taken by Christians when Jews were expelled from the city, and they were actually used to build churches and other places as well. You see these fragments. And again, it's a chilling reminder of the fact that this was once the center of a great Jewish community. And the other thing also is that when you go to Spain, you're literally surrounded in every city with what they call the Great Plaza. This is where people come together to have coffee. Buskers will often gather. It's a pride of joy. You have to remember, however, that almost in every one of these major cities, these were sites of inquisitions. This comes from the Prado Museum. It's a fantastic, huge painting of an inquisitorial trial where Jews were often burned at the stake, and they had to make public confessions of their false conversion to Christianity, and so on and so on. And again, you stand in one of these places sipping a coffee, and you're not aware that quite literally under the cobblestones is this terrible Jewish story. And again, in Cordova, Barcelona, Toledo, you see this as well, the presence of the absence. The most chilling reminder of this concept of presence of absence is an underground car park in the city of Seville. In fact, this is where, whenever I take my groups into Seville, after they've seen all the sites, I say, you're actually going to see one of the most exciting places in Seville. And they're looking forward with a great deal of anticipation. I take them down a set of stairs and we end up in this car park. What you actually see here is what was once a Jewish cemetery, right? The car park is now a cemetery, and the only remnant today is when they discovered it, when they were digging up the place to build the car park, is you have behind this glass wall the remnant of a Jewish tombstone. Of course, they took them all away and so on, and you get a map there, a representational map of what this, again, this is such an amazing, jarring moment to understand that you are literally standing on sacred ground. In other words, what was once a Jewish cemetery. Anyway, that's enough for that topic. And really, it's a lead-in for what we are going to be talking about today. Let me just get my other PowerPoint up, and I will share that with you. So what we're going to be talking about today is extending on the theme of let me just get myself going, on the theme of memory, heritage, and history through Jewish eyes. What I'm going to be doing today, next week, is using medieval Spain as a case study of that sort of theme, case study of memory, heritage, and history through Jewish eyes. Now, why focus on Spain? The reason I do that is because of the many amazingly great Jewish stories that one can tell in the panorama of Jewish history, the one that really dominates the collective memory of the Jewish historical experience is the story of Jews in Spain. Almost universally, even if Jews don't know a lot about Jewish history, when you refer to them about the story of Jews in Spain, immediately it will evoke for them this concept of a golden age of some sort, and so on. It's also a place which is laden with an incredible Jewish story, but also a place of heritage. And when I talk about the concept of heritage, many of you may be aware of the fact that when we talk about the Jewish world today, we are actually talking about a world which consists of three major diasporas. We talk about the Ashkenazi diaspora. The Ashkenazi diaspora is a diaspora which originated in the Franco-German area and then moved to Poland. There's another diaspora which is known as the Mizrahi diaspora, the Oriental diaspora, which is essentially the diaspora of Middle Eastern Jews, whether it's Iraq or Iran or Yemen and whatever have you. In fact, that is the oldest of the three diasporas. But the third diaspora is a diaspora whose name was taken from Spain itself. And it's called the diaspora of the Sephardic Jews, the Sephardi diaspora. So Spain, as a story in the panorama of Jewish history, lent its name to one of the, if not, it's certainly in the Middle Ages, the greatest of the Jewish diaspora. So the Spanish story captures together this concept of memory, of heritage, and history. So let's begin with that story. I'm going to focus today fundamentally on the Jewish story in Spain under Muslim rule. But before I take you there, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the period before the arrival of Islam in Spain. I want to begin with the classical Roman period. In other words, this is the period when Rome was still a pagan empire. And when you go to Spain today, there are very, very few remnants of that classical period. One of the very few is this magnificent, magnificent Roman aqueduct in Segovia. Segovia is a stunning, stunning city, but the thing that makes it most famous and most visited is this incredible aqueduct that stands in Segovia. You go to a place like Barcelona, and all you will really see are remnants. You get this remnant of a Roman wall alongside a medieval structure. But this is the classical Roman period, and it's already at that time, we know that there is evidence of a very, very tiny Jewish presence in what was then Roman Spain. For example, we have this sarcophagus of a young child, a burial thing. And what you actually have here is inscriptions in Hebrew, in Greek, and Latin. And one of the things you will notice that it's decorated with is the well-known Jewish menorah, the seven-branch candlestick. Now that comes from the classical Roman period. Further evidence of that classical period can be found in some other Jewish tombstones going back to this very, very early period. And then, of course, as many of you will know, there was a moment in history when pagan Rome became Christian Rome. In the early 4th century, when Constantine, on his deathbed at least, converted to Christianity, at that time, pagan Rome became Christian Rome. And again, you have evidence of Jewish presence in what was Christian Rome in Granada. This is what's called the Puerta de Elvira, the Gate of Elvira. And behind this gate, we know that in the early 4th century, there was a church council that gathered. And one of the subjects of discussion regarded the whole question of the presence of the Jews, the legal and theological position of the Jews. And there is a reference made to Jews living in Spain at that particular time. What then happened is that in the story of the great Roman Empire, the Roman Empire itself, as many of you will know, was infiltrated by various barbarian groups. There was an infiltration and invasion, and certainly the western part of the Roman Empire basically disintegrated and was taken over by many, many different barbarian groups. And one of the groups that came into Spain and dominated there were a group known as the Visigoths. They were a sort of a Germanic tribal group that infiltrated, made its way into the Roman Empire and occupied what was once Roman Spain. They were there, they entered there in 456 and were there until the early 8th century. The only real presence that you will see today of anything Visigoth is not a Visigoth building, but a Visigoth museum in Toledo. In fact, in the whole of Spain, there are very, very few remnants left of what was once this, century and a half of Visigoth rule. But it's a period in which Jews were present. We know for a fact that they were. We know that for a fact because Jews, when the Visigoths first came into Spain, were tolerated as a religious minority, experienced a great deal of prosperity, religious freedom. And then about a century after their arrival in Spain, the Visigoths embraced Catholicism. And as converts to the new faith of Catholicism, they started to persecute Jews terribly. And Jewish life came under a great deal of threat. In fact, there were forced conversions and so on and so on. So you can well imagine that in 711, when the Muslims entered Spain, they were actually welcomed as sort of saviors by the Jewish people. The Jews living in Spain at the time, suffering as they did under Christian Visigoth rule, openly welcomed the Muslims as they came into Spain. And what you have here is a map of the invasion of 711. What's amazing is that they crossed over basically from the southern boundary of Spain. For those of you familiar with the map, you'll know that that is sort of Morocco and Spain almost touch each other. So they came from North Africa, and just look at the map itself, you'll see within a period of a few years, from 711, 712, 713, they conquered almost the whole of the Spanish peninsula. In fact, the only part of Spain that remained in Christian hands was the northern extreme part, where Muslims were not able to enter. This will become a very, very important part of the Christian story a little bit later on, but pretty much the whole of the Spanish peninsula, except for the extreme northern part of the country, came under Muslim rule. Now, the first stage of that Muslim presence is what's known as the Emirate of Cordova. When we talk about an emirate, think about a kingdom and a princedom. Kingdom and princedom. So when we talk in similar terms in the context of the Muslim story, the kingdom is the caliphate, the princedom would be the emirate. An emir would be like a prince, the caliph would be like a king, if you want. So the first stage of the Muslim story in Spain is that an emirate was established in Cordova, and basically the first sign of the emirate in Cordova is that building across the bridge, which I talked about last week, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more as well. And that, of course, is the Grand Mosque, the Mezquita of Cordova. It was actually, the construction of that Mezquita was actually begun by the emir of Cordova, the first emir of Cordova. His name was Abd Rahman I. He actually came from Damascus. He was part of a royal Muslim family in Damascus, and as part of the invasion of Spain in the early 8th century, he made his way over in the middle of the 8th century and became the first emir of Islam in Cordova at the time. That's what the Mezquita looks like. You get the bird's eye view, and he actually began the process of building the Mezquita. You can actually see it very clearly on this particular map. So what you actually have here is the original Mezquita that was built by this small little bit here, where my cursor is. That's the beginning of the Mezquita that was built by Abd Rahman I, and subsequently different caliphs began to expand the Mezquita and add to it at various stages. It took at least a century to complete the building of the whole Mezquita, which is what you see today. So when Abd Rahman I came over to Spain, he simply started the process. And by the time we get to the year of about 900, the Mesquita has reached its full completion. And with the completion of the Mesquita, we also enter the period of the Caliphate. In other words, we go from an emirate, remember a princedom, to a stage of Caliphate in Cordoba. And the Caliphate of Cordoba began in 929. They were basically the first Caliph of Cordoba was an actual descendant of the first emir, Abd Rahman I. So the first Caliph of Cordoba was Abd Rahman III, and he came to power in 929. And what he actually did is he decided to move the capital from Cordoba and build his own administrative city, a place called Medinat al-Zahra. I showed you this last week, I think, if I remember correctly. And this is an archaeological site which represents the beginnings of the Caliphate. Think of Medinat al-Zahra as Washington. Washington in the Washington, D.C. is the administrative and political capital of the United States.
Oh my goodness, Paul seemed to have froze for me. Is that true for Paul? You froze for me for just about a minute or so, or maybe not a minute, maybe 30 seconds.
Am I okay? Am I okay?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Ah, okay. So this marks the beginning of the Caliphate. Very few people know about this. When they go to Cordoba, they go, of course, to the Mesquita, but they're actually often unaware that about 8 to 10 kilometers of this is the beginnings of the grand period of Muslim rule in Spain. The emirate was really the lead up, was the appetizer, if you want, to the main course of this particular story. And there's this very famous painting that you will often come across, and this represents the grandeur of the Caliphate of Cordoba. The Caliph is sitting here and is, as you can see, receiving a monk who has come from the Christian world. And this is very typical of the period where the Caliph would sit and receive visitors from the world. But you can get a sense of the grandeur of this particular period. Now, this is a period where the Jewish presence starts to become much more visible. Jews were already living in Spain during the period of the Emirate. You remember I told you that during Visigoth rule, Jews were living in Spain as a persecuted minority. So when the Muslims came over in 711, there was already a Jewish story, but that really grew to great prominence during the period of the Caliphate. And still today, when you go to Cordoba, you will end one of the gates that you can sort of enter the city through is what was then known as Bab al-Yahud, the Muslim name for the Gate of the Jews. This is the place where the Jewish quarter was during the period of the Caliphate. And again, when you go through Cordoba, you remember I spoke to you before about this concept of the presence of the absence. You would really not know that this was once one of the great thriving centers of Jewish life and culture, if not for the fact that a street sign saying Judios, Street of the Jews, Juderia, in other words, the old Jewish quarter, and that's all that's left. You walk through the streets of Cordoba and you feel the absence of this once great presence of a thriving Jewish culture under Muslim rule in Cordoba. Now, what happens in the next stage of the story in 1031, for reasons that I'm not going to go into simply because I don't have the time, but in 1031, the Caliphate basically collapses, really more for internal reasons. There's a great deal of internal dissension and whatever have you, various palace intrigues. The Caliphate as a unified political entity. You can see my cursor up here. This is the Califato de Cordova. Notice again, it occupies most of the area that had been conquered in 711. But in 1031, when the Caliphate disintegrated, it broke up into individual kingdoms. And these individual kingdoms were known as Taifa. Taifa is simply a Muslim word for a small party kingdom, a petty kingdom. So what was once a unified Muslim entity was replaced by individual Muslim kingdoms all over the place of Spain. And that happened in 1031, the period of the Taifa. Now, a very important part of that particular story, and this is where the Christian and the Muslim story starts to merge very, very carefully. Remember, in 711, the Muslims overran the whole of the country, or most of the country. But what you start to see happening from the 8th century on, all the way down to 1492, is a process of some 500 years or so, a process of some 700 years, that the Christians will gradually, very gradually, begin to reconquer Muslim Spain and turn it into, once again, a Christian country. So a very, very important part of understanding the story of the Taifas is understanding the story of the Christian reconquest, because as Christians began to move through Spain, they encountered individual Muslim kingdoms as well. So this is an indispensable part of the story. Interestingly, by the way, there's not a great deal archaeological evidence of the Reconquest period, but if you want to see it graphically displayed today in Spain, there's no better place to do that than a place called Plaza España in Seville. I know this looks very medieval, but in fact it's 20th century. This is what the Spaniards built. I think it was in the year of 1920 when Spain became the place of the World Trade Fair. And in honor of the World Trade Fair, they built this magnificent, stunning trade center, center of world trade. Interestingly, by the way, for those of you who are fans of Star Wars, this place was actually used to film one of the Star Wars episodes as well. But the reason I'm pointing to you is that this place is literally surrounded by little alcoves with these ceramic sort of plates. This is what they look like. And one of the things you will see is many of the plates, each one of the places in Spain has its own little alcove, each administrative center of Spain. And in a number of them, the thing that they chose to represent their municipality by was the Reconquista. So this is the Reconquest of Toledo, the Reconquest of Almeria, and so on and so on. So if you want to sort of in a single place get a physical and a very graphic representation of the Reconquista, as it's known in Spanish, this is the place where you'll see it at its best. Anyway, let's come back to the story of the Muslims and the question of how that interacts with the Christian story of the Reconquista will become clearer a little bit later on today. So let's come back to the map that I showed you, the conquest of Spain in 711, and what I want to show you is to sort of show you how the first stage of the story begins to run into the story of the Islamic story as well. So the Reconquista began in the year of about 718. So within 7 years of the Muslims entering Spain, the Christians very slowly began the process of reconquering that country. By 750, they had gained control of that. Well, they hadn't really gained control. That's the part of the country that they always had control of. Let me just take you back to the map. You remember that part was always in Christian hands. And at the end of the 8th century, that was still the case. But gradually, they started to move down. And one of the momentous periods was when they came to the city of Toledo in 1085. Toledo at the time was one of the great Muslim ta'ifas. You remember I talked about the ta'ifa, a Muslim kingdom, and the kingdom of Toledo was one of the great Muslim kingdoms at the time. And in 1085, that city fell into Christian hands. when you go to Toledo today, that is best represented by this magnificent statue of King Alfonso VI. Alfonso VI was the Christian ruler who entered Toledo and recaptured it from Muslim hands. He's a very, very important, iconic figure in the history of Spain. I mean, any kid going to a school in Spain today studying Spanish history, I don't know whether they'll remember it, but they certainly will have been taught about the importance of Alfonso VI. You remember I talked to you about the Plaza España? That's how Toledo chose to represent its history in the Plaza España. Again, you see Alfonso VI entering the city of Toledo and the Muslims kneeling in an act of submission to the entry of the Christian forces. For those of you who have not seen it, feast your eyes on that. That's about as virtually as you will get to Spain, but it's one of the most stunning places in Spain today. There are vantage points where you can best see the city of Toledo, and this is one of them. So you get the statue of Alfonso VI. What's very interesting is that as you move around that particular traffic roundabout, what's very interesting is that you see a number of inscriptions on three sides of the traffic roundabout. One of them is actually an inscription in Arabic, right? So you get an inscription in Castilian on one side, excuse me, on one side of the roundabout. Another one, an inscription in Arabic, and look at that, another one, an inscription in Hebrew. And the inscription in Hebrew begins with the Hebrew words Yefenof, which are the opening words of a poem that was written by one of the famous Jews of medieval Spain, a man by the name of Yehuda Halevi. And when they built this particular roundabout and they wanted to sort of, if you want, mark the entry of Alfonso into the city, they also chose to place on the roundabout a number of inscriptions, including this medieval Hebrew one. It reads, "Beautiful heights, joy of the world, city of a great king. From the far, far west, my soul yearns for thee." Now, that's the rest of the poem. I've included it for you. But the reason I point this out to you is that, firstly, if you were entering the city of Toledo, you would probably not even know as a tourist that this was the case. You have to be sort of taken there with a knowledgeable educator or guide to know that there's a Jewish story behind this particular statue. The interesting thing is that even if one were to point this out to you and read this poem without giving you context and tell you that this was written by a Jew of the Middle Ages, you would think that this Jew was actually talking about the great city of Toledo, beautiful heights, city of a great king. In fact, that's not the case. In fact, what Yehuda Halevi was doing was writing a poem about the city of kings, meaning the city of Jerusalem. The interesting thing, however, is that Halevi had never visited Jerusalem at this particular time. According to popular legend, he did eventually come to the Holy Land, but that's a contested story. But when he wrote this poem, this great poem in Toledo, city of a great king, he was imagining what Jerusalem might be like. This was a figment of his imagination. And one of the things that we actually talk about when we stand at this vista over city is we talk about the concept of what is it like to remember a place that you have never visited. Because you've got to remember that Jerusalem had always been part of Jewish collective memory. We are talking today about memory, history, and heritage. Jews had for hundreds and hundreds of years, since the time that they were exiled by the Romans in the year of 70, Jerusalem remained part of their collective memory. But it's a place that most of them in the medieval world had never, ever visited. They had a yearning for this place. They had some image of what Jerusalem was like. And this is a moment where when I'm with my tour group, we talk about the concept of how do you actually represent something as part of your collective memory that you've never actually seen. It's an opportunity to talk about how Jewish collective memory actually operated through the ages. Okay, so up to now, we've been talking about the transition from an emirate to a caliphate to individual kingdoms, Kingdom of Toledo, the Kingdom of Seville, Kingdom of Cordova. But what actually happened is that in the year of 1090, there was a group that arrived from North Africa and entered Spain in the year of 1090. They were a group known as the Almoravids. The Almoravids were a Muslim Berber tribe. You may have heard of the Berbers. The Berbers were the indigenous population of North Africa, especially places like Morocco. And by the year of 1090, it had become really, they had occupied pretty much the whole of this part of North Africa, including Algeria, including Morocco, and so on and so on. They had established themselves, and then in 1090 moved across into the Spanish Peninsula. Now, in order to understand, and this is a depiction of their arrival in the year of 1090, they remained in, remember, they were a Muslim group, but they basically took over from the individual to the ta'ifas. Basically, what happened is that the individual kingdoms fell, and the Almoravids established a unified Muslim presence in Spain once again, and were there from 1090 till 1145. Now, what then happened is that in 1145, another very, very powerful group established itself in North Africa. They was known as the Almohads. They overthrew the previous group of the Almoravids, and they were now in power, and they too, in the year of 1145, crossed over into Spain. And Spain fell into the hands of the Almohad invasion. Still a Muslim country. Notice by this stage, by 1145, the Reconquista, this is Spain, has moved all the way down to more than half of the country. Remember, Toledo had fallen in 1085. By 1145, the Christians had advanced a little further into Spain at the time. So when the Almohads crossed over into Spain, they occupied this part of Muslim Spain at the time. Today, by the way, that's the depiction of the Almohad invasion. But when you go to Spain today, there are very, very few remnants of the Almohad period. But one of the few of them is this gorgeous, gorgeous Muslim minaret. There was once this huge, where this church is now, there was once this great mosque in Seville. And unlike the Mosque of Cordova, which remained standing, the Mosque of Seville, when the Christians entered the city, was totally destroyed. But the only thing that they left was this Muslim minaret. And notice the way they symbolized their reconquest of the city is that on top of the minaret, they placed a Christian symbol with a cross at the top, right? This was the symbol of their reconquest of the city. That's one of the few pieces of evidence you will have of a presence of an Almohad presence in Spain. The other one is the very famous statue of Maimonides in the city of Cordova. Now, Maimonides was born in Cordova at about the time when the Almohads arrived in the city. But because the Almohads instituted a period of intense anti-Jewish and anti-Christian persecution, many, many Jews left the country at that particular time. We know that Maimonides was a child of about 12 when the Almohads came into the city of Cordova, and he and his family actually fled Spain and eventually ended up in North Africa. So really the great story of Maimonides as a young adult and an adult is really not a Spanish story, even though the Cordovans choose to represent him in this way, but is very, very much a story that takes place in North Africa and eventually Egypt as well. Now, what happens at this point? Remember, Toledo was captured in the year of 1085. Once the Christians got into Toledo in 1085, they were pretty much halted by the Almohads. The Almohads managed to prevent the further movement of the Reconquista. But what then happened is that in the year of 1212, the Christians who were based at this point in Toledo, in the center of the country, managed to move all the way down to Las Navas de Tolosa. And this is a very, very important battle, because this battle marks the beginning of the end of Muslim rule in Spain. The Almohads are still in control of this part of the country. The southern part of the country is still in Muslim hands, but that battle of Las Navas de Tolosa is going to mark the beginnings of the end of not only the rule of the Almohads, but Muslim rule in general. What you will see happening, for example, is that from Navas de Tolosa, about 24 years later, the Muslims reach the city of Cordova. They recapture that, and shortly, and this is how Cordova, the reconquest of Cordova, is represented in a well-known Spanish painting, where you see Ferdinand III, he was the ruler of the time, enters the city of Cordova, and again, you see the Muslims submitting to the power of Ferdinand III. This very, very interesting illustration is an illustration of the famous, of the bells that were taken from the church of Santiago, the extreme northern part of Spain. There was a church of Compostela de Santiago, and what actually happened hundreds of years before, when the Muslims entered that city in the extreme northern part of the country, they carried away the bells from the bell tower and brought it to Cordova. In 1236, when the city was recaptured, you can see these Muslim slaves were ordered to bring the bells all the way back to the northern part of the country as a symbol of the reconquest of the city. What then happened in 1248 is that the city of Seville fell to the Christian conquerors. Ferdinand III, once again, was the king who entered that particular city. And the best evidence of that conquest is that what is now the third largest cathedral in the world was a cathedral that was started. The building of that cathedral was commenced by Ferdinand III. And to build that cathedral, he actually knocked down the Great Mosque of Seville. It's a very interesting story, because Ferdinand III, when he came into Cordova, instead of destroying the Great Mosque of Cordova, he did something very different that I'm going to show you in a minute. But here he destroyed the great Mosque of Seville and replaced it with this Grand Seville. And as I said to you before, the only thing that was left remaining as a symbol of conquest was this particular Muslim minaret, with, of course, a Christian bell tower erected on the top of the minaret. Okay, now, what for all intents and purposes, what's important to understand, for all intents and purposes, when the Muslims got to Seville in 1248, that marked the effective end of Muslim rule. I say the effective end, not the final end, because the only sign of a Muslim presence that remained after 1248 was Granada. Granada would fall some period later, some 200 or so years later, in 1492. But by 1248, almost the whole of the Spanish peninsula had been reconquered by the Christians, and the only remaining place was Granada. And this is the period where you enter what I call the last gasp, if you want, of Muslim rule in Spain, and it's the Emirate of Granada. You remember we talked before about Emirate and Caliphate. Granada established a family known as the Nasrids, established themselves in Granada at the time. And you might ask yourself, why was it that if the Christians had got to the city of Seville in 1248, why did they just not keep going and reach the city of Granada? Basically, firstly, they had fought a long, long war of reconquest. Their resources were depleted. And one of the interesting things is that they had reached a deal with the family of the Nasrids in Granada and said, look, if you don't attack us while we're doing a cleanup operation, we will leave you alone. It was an interesting case of Muslims betraying their fellow Muslims in Seville. And they basically allowed the Christians to continue the reconquest of the rest of Spain, and they were left alone for a period of about 200 years or so. And what they ended up building was the magnificent Alhambra Palace. The Alhambra Palace, which was built under Nasrid rule, is really the last great gasp of Muslim grandeur in the country of Spain. And this is where you see the very famous picture, which depicts or one of a number, the capitulation of Granada. This is Boabdil Bill, who was the last ruler of Granada. A beautiful picture because he's looking back on the city of Granada as it falls into Muslim hands. There's a beautiful, beautiful story told that as Boabdil Bill was leaving the city, he was accompanied by his mother as well. His mother, sort of in a rather unkind moment, according to the story, said to him, "That which you could not save as a man, you cry over as a woman," right? That which you could not save as a man, you now cry over as a woman. Not what you would call a warm and fuzzy mother. You would have thought she would want to comfort her son at this time, but in fact condemned him for his inability to save the city at the time. And what then happens is that this is the end. This is the end of the story. This is the time when in 1492, the whole of the city, the whole of Spain is now once again in Christian hands. And you can actually see that very graphically represented by this map. The other map gave you a sort of a more visual picture, graphic picture of the progress. But I think here you can actually start to see when different places in Spain fell into Christian hands. So, for example, you remember I said to you that the northern part of the country remained in Christian hands pretty much, and progressively, as early as 856, the city of Leon, which would become eventually the Kingdom of Leon, as far as Spain. Look at Barcelona. Barcelona is, of course, a place that is well known to most people. By 801, remember in 711, the Muslims had entered the country. In less than a century, Barcelona had once again fallen back into Christian hands. Now, the reason I mention this is that when you go to a city like Barcelona, you would be hard-pressed to see any visible signs of a Muslim presence. Archaeologically, architecturally, very, very hard-pressed to see any signs. And that's easy to explain. The Muslims were there for less than 100 years. And to establish an architectural presence takes a long period of time. So you therefore find that a lot of these places in the northern part of the country, even though they were in Muslim hands, Christians had reconquered them fairly early on, and you don't see many, many signs of a Muslim presence. However, when you go to Toledo, when you go to Madrid, which were in Muslim hands certainly for a longer period of time, in Toledo, you will certainly see alongside much evidence of a Christian presence. You'll also see evidence of a Muslim presence as well. The further you go down south in the country, the Muslim presence is all over the place. So let's come into the final stage of our discussion today and talk against the backdrop of what I've been talking about, against the backdrop of telling you the story of the Muslims in Spain and how they were eventually forced out of the country, I want to talk about the Jewish story in the Muslim phase of the Spanish story. Now, this is a story which, in the context of Jewish collective historical memory, has often come to be referred to as a golden age. Now, notice I put the term golden age in inverted commas, and not only because it's a sort of a technical term, but also because it's a contested term as well. And we'll talk about that very, very shortly. But in any event, when we talk about the golden age in Spain, there was a very well-known, I've got his name at the bottom of the screen here, there was a very well-known philosopher and chronicler. Some people refer to him as a historian, but I think he was more a chronicler. His name was Abraham ibn Daud, and he actually lived at the time in Muslim Spain. And in writing about the period of the Caliphate, remember, this is the Caliphate of Cordova. In writing about the period of the Caliphate, he says, in the days of Chaste, I'm going to talk about Chaste very shortly. In the days of Chaste, that is during the period of the Caliphate, they, that is the Jews, began to chirp. They began to chirp like birds. And then he goes on and says this, during the period of the Taifas, you remember when the Caliphate fell apart and they were replaced by individual kingdoms, in the days of Samuel Hanagid, that is in the Taifa of Granada, they did not merely chirp like birds, but they sang aloud. So what he's actually doing here in this one sentence, he is summarizing the Jewish story in Muslim Spain. It's a Jewish story where during the period of the Caliphate, they began to develop this great, great culture. They began to chirp, but it really came to full efflorescence in the period of Granada. It's interesting because you would think that the great heights of the Jewish experience would have been in a period of the Caliphate, but in fact, what actually happened is that when the individual kingdoms replaced the unified Caliphate of Cordova, they began to rival its previous grandeur. They were in competition with each other. Each individual kingdom wanted to become like a mini caliphate. And it's in that period that the Jews really began to develop a great deal of influence and so on. So the question then is, if we're indeed talking in the context of Jewish collective memory about this great golden age, what actually made the golden age of Spain golden from a Jewish point of view? I want to suggest to you that there were three main elements that made this age golden. Firstly, there was what we might describe as Jewish political power. Now, you have to understand that the Middle Ages were a period where Jews were powerless. When the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in the year of 70, from the year of 70, with the exception of a period of about 100 years, from the year of 70 till 1948, when the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, was established, Jews did not enjoy any form of political power, at least in terms of having their own country, except for a period of about 100 years. They were a powerless group living under foreign rule. But what makes this period interesting is that as powerless as they were, in the context of Muslim rule, there were individual Jews who did reach great heights of political power. Remember, I showed you this picture before of the Caliphate of Cordova. This is the Caliph receiving visitors at the time, and the person who is standing here is believed to have been, possibly, we don't know, but at least we can imagine it to have been a Jew by the name of Chaste ibn Shaprut. Chaste ibn Shaprut was a fascinating individual who was actually a Jewish doctor who entered the service of the Caliph at the time. Remember, I talked to you before about Medina al-Zahara, the administrative capital that was built by Abd Rahman III. We know that Chaste ibn Shaprut entered the service as a doctor in the court of Abd Rahman III. but he was also a translator. He had a knowledge of different languages. And it was that enabled him to reach great heights of political power in the court of the caliph. You can imagine that if you had not only a knowledge of Arabic, but a knowledge of Hebrew, a knowledge of Greek, a knowledge of Latin, you were going to be a great asset in the caliphal court. And we know that for a fact that Khasta ibn Shaprut was instrumental in actually bringing about meetings between people in the Christian world and the world of the caliph as well. So this is Khasta ibn Shaprut, a Jew who reached the great heights of political power. He became really effectively what today we would call a foreign minister or a secretary of state. He reached great heights. The other great individual is Samuel ibn Nagrela. Now, whereas Khasta was an individual who lived in the period of the caliphate, this is in the period of the Taifa of Granada. And Samuel ibn Nagrela reached even greater heights of power than did Khasta ibn Shaprut. Samuel ibn Nagrela, there's an interesting story told about him. He started his life as a spice merchant living in the city of Granada, but also as a sort of a side job, translated for Muslims living in the city. They would often receive documents or they wanted to write letters. He would often write letters. And this came to the attention of the Sultan of Granada. And because of his ability with languages, he was brought into the court of the Sultan of Granada and again reached great heights of political power. In fact, so much so that he actually became what today we would refer to as a prime minister. He quite literally became the right-hand man of the Sultan of Granada. This is a picture, so much so that he actually led, as a Jew, remember, he actually led Muslim armies in campaigns against the Christians at the time. Remember, the Christians were involved in reconquest, and this was virtually unheard of. To have a Jew riding a horse, bearing arms, leading a Muslim army in battle was virtually unheard of. And Samuel ibn Nagrela was this incredible individual who was not only a great political figure, he was a rabbinic scholar. He wrote a number of important rabbinic works. He was a great poet as well. He wrote this amazing Hebrew poetry as well. So in other words, he was what today we would refer to as a Renaissance man, embodying these many, many different sort of qualities. So again, this sort of concept of Jewish political power is what made the Golden Age golden. I would say, by the way, that in the Christian world of Europe, whether it's France, Germany, Italy, other places, to have Jews aspiring and reaching these great heights of political power was quite literally unknown. This was a feature that was very, very much part of the Jewish story in Spain. Also, by the way, in the Christian period, which we'll talk about next week, but nothing like the Muslim period that we're talking about today. The other thing that made the Golden Age golden is that this was a period where we might talk about a sort of a cultural synthesis between Jews and Muslims. In other words, this is a period when Jews borrowed very, very heavily from various aspects of Muslim cultural and intellectual endeavors. For example, we know that this is a period, for example, when you see the rise of great Jewish philosophers. And you have to understand that Jews discovered philosophy, at least in the classical Greek sense of the word. They discovered philosophy from their Arab counterparts. The Arabs had, you've got to remember that classical Greek thinking, classical Greek philosophy had sort of become virtually forgotten during what we call the Christian Dark Ages. During the Middle Ages, there was a period of time when often referred to as the Dark Ages, and much of the grandeur of the ancient classical world sort of fell into the background, including the philosophy of the ancient Greeks. Now, interestingly, it was the Arabs who basically rediscovered that great classical philosophical tradition and developed what came to be known as a Greco-Arabic tradition of philosophy. Greek, Greco-Arabic. In other words, what they did is they turned pagan Greek philosophy into a philosophy that was compatible with the monotheistic belief of Islam. Hence, it came to be called Greco-Arabic philosophy. And the Jews basically learnt that philosophy from them and developed their own Judeo-Greco philosophy as well. For example, we know Maimonides, who was one of the greatest philosophers of the Jewish medieval world, basically developed a philosophy that he learned from his Arabic counterparts. So Maimonides very much respected the philosophy of Aristotle. But for him, it was all Greek to him. He did not have a knowledge of Greek. He basically learnt about the philosophy of Aristotle from Arabic translations of Greek philosophy. And not only that, but Jews also developed a whole body of incredible secular Hebrew poetry. It's not that Jews had not written poetry before this period, but whatever poetry they had written was very much for liturgical purposes and religious purposes. The Muslims had developed, particularly the Arab Muslims, had developed this incredible body of both religious and secular poetry. And Jews basically learnt that tradition from them. And the great age of the great golden age of Spanish Jewry, one of its defining features was the invention, quite literally the invention of this beautiful body of secular Hebrew poetry. I'd mentioned to you before, by the way, Samuel ibn Agrella. He was one of the great Jewish golden age poets living in Spain at the time. Chasta ibn Shaprut, even though he was a doctor by profession, not a poet himself, but actually sponsored, he was a very wealthy man, sponsored a number of great Jewish poets in Spain as well at the time. But the point I'm making here is that these traditions of philosophy and Hebrew poetry was something that Jews had borrowed from Muslims at the time. Again, this notion of a Jewish-Christian synthesis is not something that you would really speak about. It was something very much that characterized the golden age of Jews living under Muslim rule. And you get this depiction. I mean, there's this well-known collection, a great book simply called Jewish Philosophers. The author is Stephen Katz. So those of you who are interested in Jewish philosophy, this is probably the best single book summary of that. But here you get this interesting depiction of poetry being recited in one of these beautiful Muslim Spanish gardens. You have to remember that when the Arabs developed this body of poetry, it was not simply poetry for its own sake. This was poetry that was recited in a social setting. And they would get together in their gardens and have what today we would call a soiree. You know, a soiree is when people get together and there's music and there's poetry and there's drinking and whatever. And one of the features of Muslim life in medieval Spain was these soirees, if you want, these garden parties where they would come together and recite poetry that they had written at the time. We know, by the way, that Jews participated in similar sort of garden parties as well, a tradition that they borrowed from their Muslim counterparts. And then finally, the last feature of what made the Jewish Golden Age golden is that as much as Jews were involved in the surrounding Muslim culture of the time, they were also developing Jewish learning and scholarship, right? This was one of the great periods where many great works of Jewish learning and scholarship, biblical commentaries, works of Jewish philosophy, works of Jewish law and so on were developed in Spain as well. And Samuel ibn Agrella embodied not only the great philosopher, the great poet, but also was a great rabbinic scholar as well. So individually, you will find aspects of this in other parts of Europe. But what made the Jewish story in Muslim Spain unique is it's the coming together of all three elements. It's the interconnectedness of these three elements that makes the Jewish story under Muslim rule so unique at that particular time. But then the other side of the coin is that we can tend to over-romanticize this. when we talk about this glittering golden age, we can sometimes get carried away with it. And one of the important things to understand is that the whole concept of a Jewish golden age is a contested story. It's a story that is debated amongst historians. So what we have to understand is that this is represented in different ways. So, for example, a historian by the name of Maria Rosa Menokal will talk about the ornament of the world, right? The great, great beauty. The way she describes it is almost an interfaith utopia. That when look at this, how Muslims, how Jews, how Christians created a culture of tolerance in medieval Spain. If that's the only book that you would read, you would think this was a life of an interfaith utopia. On the other hand, at the opposite extreme, you get a writer by the name of Marara who talks about this is just a myth. In fact, the idea that Muslims tolerated Jews and Christians is just an absolute myth. And he focuses, rather than focusing on the period, on the elements of Jews, Christians, and Muslims interacting with each other in cooperation with each other, he talks about the discrimination and, in fact, to some degree, persecution of Jews living under Muslim rule. So he takes the story to the other extreme. The scholar who takes a middle ground position is a scholar by the name of Mark Cohen. He's actually a very prominent medieval Jewish historian at Princeton University. He's now retired. He's an emeritus professor, but he actually wrote what I regard as probably the most important book of this period, Under Crescent and Cross, The Jews in the Middle Ages. And what he does is he undertakes a comparative study. He says, in order to answer the question of how golden was the Golden Age, you can't answer that in isolation from thinking about Jews living under both Christian and Muslim rule. Because if you think about it in isolation, you could very well end up agreeing with Marara. You could end up saying it was a terrible period. He said the only sensible way to talk about this story is to say, how did Jews living under Muslim rule fare in comparison to Jews living under Christian rule in other parts of Europe? In other words, it's a question that can only be answered sensibly in comparative terms. And in this book, he examines this question in great detail. He comes to the conclusion that in comparison to Jews living under Christian rule, Jews living under Muslim rule fared much, much better. So to that extent, they enjoyed a golden age. In other words, to the extent that Jews living under Christian rule suffered considerable persecution, etc., to that extent, in comparative terms at least, they did much better under Muslim rule. But he qualifies it and says, but it was not a garden of roses. Let's not get carried away with this myth of an interfaith utopia. In other words, he straddles a sort of a middle ground, if you want. And finally, we come to the end of the Golden Age under Muslim rule. There are, we can sort of say, when did that actually happen? Well, the beginning of that end actually happened in Granada. Because you remember the great Granada was Samuel ibn Nagdela, the Jew who became a prime minister, the right-hand man of the caliph, led Muslim armies into battle and so on. That very, very same Granada where Jews had reached the great heights of this so-called Golden Age, in 1066, the Jews of Granada were massacred by the Muslims of the city. The reason for that is, by the way, is that Samuel ibn Nagdela had actually passed away, and his position had passed on into the hands of his son, Joseph ibn Nagdela. One thing that Joseph did not possess was the humility of his father. He did not understand the very important lesson that Samuel ibn Nagdela always understood, was that a Jew living under Muslim rule had to understand that there were limits to Jewish power. The minute you overstepped those limits, the minute you did not know your place within the hierarchy, within the social hierarchy of Muslim society, that would spell disaster. And what Joseph, the son of Sabal ibn Nagrela, did is he started to overstep those limits. He started to appoint Jewish friends to major positions of power, and that was too much for the local Muslim population. In other words, for a Jew to overstep the limits of Jewish power within a Muslim country was far too much. And in 1066, the Jews of Granada were massacred. Many historians will say that that was the beginning of the end. There is no question, however, that when the Almohads, remember I talked about the Almohads who came from North Africa, entered Spain in 1145, as the Reconquista was gathering force, they came into Spain and occupied the country. And unlike their previous Muslim counterparts, they instituted a period of intense persecution against Muslims and Christians, right? In other words, under the Almoravids, under the Taifas, under the Caliphate, even though life was not a bed of roses for the Jews, they enjoyed, relatively speaking, a sort of a golden age. That all started to fall apart when the Almohads came into the country. They were a very fanatical, fundamentalist Muslim sect and imposed a period of persecution against both Jews and Christians. And for all intents and purposes, that really marked the end of the golden age of Spanish Jewry under Muslim rule. And it really becomes the segue for next week, us talking about the Jews of Spain under Christian rule. So, Ellen, we've got time now for seven or 8 minutes of questions if people have them.
Sure. So there are a couple questions that were popped into the chat. The first one was from Susan. She asked, as Christian moved south through Spain to reconquer it, is there any evidence that the Jewish population moved southward in those areas that were still Muslim?
Well, yeah, you have to understand that when the Muslims conquered Spain in 711, by that stage there was already a well-established Jewish community. By the time the Caliphate was established, some 2 centuries later, what actually started to happen is there was a considerable movement of population of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa into Spain, because that's where all the action was. That's where the opportunities were. So by the time of the Caliphate, there was a very, very well-established Jewish presence in Spain, including Toledo. So when the Christians came down all the way to Toledo in 1085, they actually found a well-established Jewish presence in the country. What's interesting is that we're going to see next week is that when the golden age of Jews under Muslim rule came to an end, as I said to you before, under the Almohads, what actually happened, interestingly, is Jews started to move from what was then Muslim Spain in the southern part of the country, moved to the Christian north, which was by then in Christian hands. We're going to talk about that more this week. But yes, the answer is, as Christians began to move southwards, they encountered local Jewish populations. And that encounter is a very, very important part of the story that we will take up next week.
Fantastic. And then the next question was from Bob. He said, during the time of the insurrection for Jewish people, what did Christians do to other non-Christian people like Muslims?
You mean during the Christian reconquest, when the Christians...
I think that is what Bob means. Yes,
yeah,
he's shaking his head yes. Perfect.
Right. So again, that's going to be very, very much the focus of our discussion next week, because the question next week is going to be, so as Christians began to advance southwards, what was the experience of Muslims and Jews living in that part of the country? Now, what we're going to see is that Christians did not fare very well at all, because basically Christians were involved in a process of reconquering the country from Muslim hands. So Muslims were not going to do particularly well. What we're going to see, interestingly, is that for a period of about 150 or 200 years, Jews are actually going to become a sort of an important ally in the Christian reconquest, because under Almohad rule, they suffered a great deal of persecution. So you remember under the Visigoths, they suffered persecution in Christian hands. They welcomed Muslims as a savior. by the time you get to the Almohads living in Spain at the time, Jews are experiencing intense persecution. And those that they once had seen as persecutors, Christians, they started to see as liberators, right? So we're going to see this very interesting interface of what happens when Christians meet Jews in the process of the Reconquista. That's going to be the focus of our discussion next week. So, Bob, to really get the full answer, you'll have to come back next week. I've lost
Mute.
That is my fault. I apologize. Okay, the next question is from Susan. What is the status of Portugal during this period? Was Portugal conquered by the Muslims?
Yes. So Portugal is a whole interesting story of its own, because what you have to appreciate is that today, when you look at a map of Spain and Portugal, Portugal, of course, is a sort of an elongated part of the country. But at one point, there was no border between Spain and Portugal. Portugal was part of the Spanish Peninsula. It was part of what we call Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula. So yes, originally, when the Muslims entered the Spanish Peninsula, they conquered not only what was today Spain, but also Portugal as well. So an important part of the story of the Reconquista is that in terms of Portugal, the story of the Reconquista is not only a story of Portugal being reconquered by Christians, but it's also a story of Portugal starting to become an independent country. So part of the Reconquista story is a story of Portugal becoming separate from Spain. So it's all interwoven.
That's wonderful. And that actually was Michelle's question as well. So that does it for my questions. I wanted to, before I formally close us out for today, last week there were a few people that asked about Paul's study seminars, his tours. So he and I had this conversation before we started. You need to be on his mailing list because they sell out relatively quickly. I think he was telling me that the one for Morocco was sold out within 8 hours. So I am going to include Paul's contact information in my follow-up email to everyone. You will get that information at the for the follow-up to get on his mailing list. Is that correct, Paul? Did I cover everything?
Yeah. But I also have to add, Ellen, if anyone is at any point interested in joining my tours, I turned 75 this year. So I don't have many years left of me of touring experience. So if you are interested, there's I'm going to keep doing it as long as my legs hold up, you know. But as all of us experience when we get to this age, we develop knee problems and hip problems. So I'll keep doing it as long as I can keep doing it. But yeah, but people are certainly welcome to get onto my list.
Terrific. So I'd like to formally close this out for today. As we wrap up today's session, I want to express my sincere gratitude to Paul, of course, for this insightful presentation, to all of you for your thoughtful engagement. I would also like to take a moment to thank these individuals for supporting today's program: Dawn and Helene Linzer, Dr. Robert Schoen and Nancy Bernstein, Deborah Demchak, Bob and Tony Mallett, and James and Louisa Rudolph. We invite you all to continue this journey with us next week for the final session, Session 3, Jewish Life in Christian Spain, a Legacy of Triumph and Tragedy. As always, this is the same Zoom link. You will get multiple reminders of the event, and for that I apologize. It's a little clunky on the back end, but we look forward to seeing you all next week. Stay safe, stay healthy, enjoy that extra hour of sunlight in the evening. Paul hasn't changed his clock, so this is actually a little bit earlier than he anticipated as well. So see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.